Have you ever criticized somebody mirthlessly, even mocked them, and leaving the environment with a haunting feeling in your chest? One day, whether it's hours, weeks, or years later, found yourself doing the very same thing you criticized them for. The it's not so much a principle, it's not so much a rule, but it's a consistency we see within maybe forms of hypocrisy, where the only thing separating one from being a hypocrite is time between the challenge and the action. This idea, this idea that the very things that you find distasteful in others turns out oftentimes to be related to one's own insecurities is a subject that I believe is worth contemplating on, at least for some time within each and every one of us. And in a series of environments, I think particularly around the way that gun culture has talked about this idea called LARPing, we can find the principle coming to pass. And so while this is a conversation embedded within the examples found within what I'm talking about in gun culture, it can apply to other places in life as well. And it quite simply is be careful how little, let's say, be careful how little thought or even consideration you put into your criticisms of others, lest you become like them. And so before we begin, I'm going to mention the show's sponsor, that is Obsidian Arms, who is a machine shop and manufacturing facility out of Minnesota, who produces a series of tools for the avid gunsmith and hobbyist, or even, say, the professional. And that is their tools come with a lifetime warranty. And so whether you're building equipment or you're maintaining a workbench or you're keeping keeping your equipment in good repair, having the right tools for the job makes it not only easier, but you're less likely to damage that equipment that you have. And an element of good stewardship is maintaining your equipment. Sure, we could be so brash as to say that if you don't keep your gear maintained, it could get you killed, but that's a little too short for this phrase. And rather, what's more important is Obsidian Arms tools and their toolkits come with a lifetime warranty. And so while you may use one punch or one tool more than the other, that one that gets worn out, you can simply send back and they'll repair it for you, or they'll replace it for you. Apologies. They also have the ability to take your ideas that you have put to paper and constructed and are looking to bring to life, and they can make that happen for you. They have the ability to produce quite a array of intricate parts that we would oftentimes find in use in the firearms industry. And more importantly, there's more than likely something on your kit or on your firearm that they may have had a hand in. So if you want to bring your business ideas to life and you're looking at getting it made either in small batches or at scale, head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com and reach out to them. If you do, give them let them know that you heard about them from here. We'd really appreciate that. But let's get into the problem with the LARP. The term LARP, L-A-R-P, or live action role playing, is a word that's oftentimes used derogatorily, but then occasionally finds its humorous elements, and you get people doing milsim or simulations of real life events, or even simulations of kind of a combat or a modern conflict or a historical piece that is a little bit more involved in the action part than mere reenactment, but is a little bit less, let's say, costly as true force-on-force training. And the LARP, though, when it comes across as a criticism, is oftentimes when somebody is accused of pretending to be something that they're never going to be. You can imagine a bunch of men getting together in the woods, practicing battle drills and patrol base activities as if they were Army Rangers, instead of making in the culture, you might say, making the choice some people might call it a sacrifice, but that is now in question, of joining the military and doing the real thing. Live action role playing is merely pretending to be something that you're not. And that, or at least that's what the criticism is supposed to be. You oftentimes see it in the framework of a you oftentimes see the criticism take place within either an internet sphere or just in perhaps idle chatter, where some other group of people is criticized for LARPing or as being nothing but LARPers. They're just pretending to do something that they're never going to do. They're pretending to be Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force operations, SWAT cops, and whatever by live action recreating scenarios and concepts that might be part of another person's profession. And this is kind of an odd concept, especially when in the conversation of gun culture, because one of the core tenets of our beliefs is the idea that people have the right to bear arms, and we as individuals and as intelligent men understand that there is more to the Second Amendment than merely the concept of possessing a firearm. As you make your way through gun culture or learning on how to use a firearm, there is a point in time where one person comes to realize that the item itself is somewhat less important than the actions and skills surrounding it. And so if a person is going so far as to accuse another group of people of so-called LARPing, there's a small bit of irony there, in the sense that those people, even though they are not doing the real thing by joining the military and going and getting training, they are in a sense simulating that training by practicing it of their own accord, which, according to what oftentimes is then created or spoken about as the ethos of gun culture, of doing things of their own accord, of us as citizens of the United States training by our own volition, by our own choice, to be capable of looking out after our environment, the criticism tends to fall a little flat. It doesn't quite stick in a intelligent argument of criticism, but rather tends to be more of a game of challenging one's ego. To call someone a LARPer is to say that they are fake, or that they spend too much time running around trying to they spend too much time running around in an imaginary world that they have created in their own head of a end of the world or disaster or whatever the type of SHTF, which is shit hit the fan type scenario. And there's a little bit of there is a little bit of legitimate criticism that could be made, although this is where the meme rule does not apply very well. And the meme rule is some things can be said in a very few amount of words and conveyed very effectively, and some things cannot. And so why write a paragraph when you can just call a person a LARPer? But I want to dig into this subject a little bit, and I want to dig into it a little bit deeper, and there's going to be ultimately two sort of chapters in the problem. And the first one is the thing that we began this episode with, the idea that a person, or this principle, this concept of beware on how loose you throw criticism at people, lest you become the very same thing that you called them out for. And so I think in some sense, the way to solve this and to illustrate this better is to look at what we might consider distasteful in somebody we would call a LARPer, or someone who is pretending to go do military-like things with their friends. The most distasteful thing might be simply to mistake reality for the game that they play. You could imagine somebody who has played a lot of Call of Duty arguing the realism of certain battlefield maneuvers with somebody who has spent years doing it in real life, and that person who has the experience in it, to the person who has experience in it, who has been there and done it and seen the reality of these kinds of activities, they might find themselves miffed of sorts that someone who has no self-experience and no self-awareness apparently to be so brazenly throwing out concepts that they don't actually comprehend. You can say that there's a difference between being able to explain or describe something. There's a difference between being able to articulate the truths about a thing. There's a difference between that and truly comprehending it. A person who comprehends a subject, let's talk about this idea of reconnaissance, not only understands how to articulate it or understands the components and how this activity would work, its principles, its rules, and so forth, but is also capable, or they also comprehend the subject enough to be able to apply it effectively in the field. And so the criticism of the LARPer in this sense is somebody who has an inflated sense of capability, of their own capability, because they are very good at merely the simulation. But you say it doesn't really stick very well. Or, in other words, what happens if you look at where that criticism comes from? The idea, I think, if you were to expand beyond merely the actions and the practices of people, we might take this concept of LARPing and expand it into a proper criticism of the kinds of people that very oftentimes make the criticism of others. And that is this idea that the idea that the quote unquote LARPers are living in a fantasy, that they are not, they're training and they're buying kit and plates and gear and night vision is all merely is all merely kind of an aesthetic thing or a game. The issue that you run into is that it's very oftentimes we find these same people to be essentially engaging in what you might call a meta LARP. Now, let's take the subject and let's turn it away from the then gun culture and look at sports and politics. If you root for a team and you buy their merchandise and you paint your home or parts of your home colors to match a certain team, and you engage in banter against other teams, even though you never play the game, you never really do anything other than toss the ball back and forth a little bit, and you never actually practice what you quote unquote preach, your expertise on the rules of the game, are in a sense LARPing. You're playing the fiction of being a meaningful participant in the environment, even though the only participant that you have is your checkbook at this point in time. You support the game by buying the merch. Now, this is different than, say, the enjoyment that a group of people might get watching a game, going to a stadium and participating in it, but it's an interesting way of illustrating the line. Another one might be spending one's time and energy fretting over national politics, but never being willing to step out of their own home and participate in the environment that they can interact with. And so one of, I think, the most classic examples of what you might consider the true LARPer in gun culture would be, in a sense, the prepper FUD, if it ever happens, I'm just going to do this kind of person. The problem with that being, and that the way that person has constructed their life in this sense, is that ultimately they are doing the same thing as the kid who is buying a plate carrier and running around in the woods with his friends, except for the only difference is the kid who is acting the LARP is actually doing something opposed to just playing situations and fictions in his mind. The argument about practicality in gun culture can very quickly become stagnant and poisoned by this continual criticism. It is one thing to call a person as a LARPer, and it is another thing to meaningfully criticize them with the intent of seeing them get better and address that, say, deficiency in a way that is productive for all parties. We see this oftentimes. I think it's are particularly visible within the internet age, where people will enjoy the downfall of others, or they will spend their time gossiping of sense in all of the failings of various internet personalities, instead of meaningfully being concerned about their well-being. And so the greatest LARP that gun culture can do is merely delusion themselves into thinking that they are a meaningful participant, without even going so far as to spend time in their community. And so if we're going to if I'm going to reiterate this concept, be careful when we get too quick to criticize other people within so-called gun culture for merely LARPing, lest we find that we are doing it ourselves, but in an even more abstract method, or not method, even in an even more abstract way, that we are not willing, we are interested in maybe training, and maybe learning how to shoot accurately, and maybe learning medical skills, or being a part of all these things. But when it comes to meaningful participation in our community, we're nowhere to be found, always taking, never giving. Or when it comes to concern for the well-being of our environment, instead of looking at the places and the areas of influence that we stand in, we instead continuously fret about the president and national politics and communities that we have no influence over. The political LARP is to know all of the memes about the president, but have no meaningful participation in making that possible and to making the outcome possible. And so you've seen it stated here, and this is even something that I myself can improve on, is being participatory in our own communities and our own environment, trying to improve that and make that better. In some ways, you can say that if we're going to make caricatures of the right and the left in this sense, while the right may criticize Antifa for LARPing the revolution, and while that criticism does land pretty solidly, it shouldn't go without mention that at least those people are willing to go out on, say, a Tuesday night and disrupt their local environment, for better or for worse. At least they believe enough in what they claim to believe, even if it's absurd, that they're willing to participate in it somehow. I'm not saying that the right should organize in some sort of pseudo-militaristic sense. In fact, every time we do that, or every time that is done, it tends to turn out quite tragically. But rather, local connections, communities, organic by interaction, is so much more robust. In fact, it's that decentralized nature that makes so much of our community so robust to, say, infiltration. And while that may mean that it causes some semblance of tribalism, this is kind of how it goes. But let's ask another question, and let's kind of change the way that we look about it. If you were able to, not necessarily snap your fingers, but let's just say you're a part of gun culture and you were able to build a life where you could physically, mentally, you could physically train to the capacity of a tier 1 operator, the top guys in the social totem pole. You could train just as much as them, have the same gear, including helicopters. You could be in just as good physical fitness, and you had enough time, money, and resources to have all of the capabilities of a top tier unit. But if you could do all of, let's just say you and I are a group of people, or even you yourself, if you were to look into your life and say, if I could get to the point, even if I could get to the point sometime in my life where I had all of the gear, all of the training, all of the equipment, all of the skills, even learning how to breach and learning how to use rockets and fly helicopters or whatever, you had all of those things. How different would you be now from then? Would it make you somebody different by merely having the gear and the skill? What happens? Because I mean, we can. This is it. I mean, it is a possibility. Let's just say some wealthy billionaire invests in you and a group of men to give them the ability to train as much as they could, and have all the gear that they wanted, and all the mission capable equipment and the support structure and the chow lines and all of that kind of stuff. If you have all that stuff provided, what then would you do? What then would we do? Who then would we be? If you could take somebody who lives in Texas, where they're dealing with these issues of immigration and even to some sense invasion, and a person had all of the skills, all of the capabilities, all of the resources at their hand, what is the thing that's missing? What is it, in a sense, what is it that makes our special operations guys, or the idea of the special operations guys, so dangerous? The answer to this is sanction, that we expect them, we as a society sanction them to go and do the things that we have trained them, or that they have trained and been built up to do. But if you and I were to do that, if you and I were to acquire that wealth and then do all the training and do all the skill sets and build all the facilities and whatever, we could have all of that at our fingertips. How different would we be? Would that be satisfactory? Think for a minute. If you're somewhere in gun culture and you're looking at buying equipment and taking training, the one thing I recommend is play the long game when it comes to gear. Slow, meaningful procuration is much more valuable than batch purchasing a bunch of stuff and then having to sort through what you don't need and whatever, even though lots of people in gun culture go through kind of like binging and purging sessions. If we could take all of that, we had all the kit and all the training and all of the vehicles, who then would we be? What then would we do? I mean, what then would we do in your own environment where you live, in your community? Would you just merely turn yourself into a celebrity, a mockery of the values that you hold? Or would you find a way to use that, let's call it great power, with great responsibility? Would it simply be to pass that information on to other people, to show that it is possible, to train up others, to work and help out? This is the core question. This is a core question that sits at the heart of gun culture, and that is, what for? Not what are you training for, what potential scenario are you training for, but what for? What is that potential for? What is that character for? What is that skill development for? We might answer some questions like, well, the pursuit of capability also serves as a bulwark not only in others but in ourselves from doing evil. People train so they do not make mistakes, and the more that people are trained, the less likely they are to participate in violence. There's this opposite proportion. The more skilled individuals are, the less likely they are to participate, especially in low-level violence. And so the question that sits at the heart, at that part of the heart of gun culture, is always going to be what for. And it might look in some cases like a perpetual identity crisis. What am I training for? What am I preparing for? What am I practicing for? What am I instilling in values? And on this show, I've tried to talk a little bit about how what I think is at the core, the heart of gun culture, is a desire to meaningfully participate in our community. You look at environments where all use of force has been outsourced to others or outsiders, and then there's not only the potentiality of those outsiders, let's call it the police, becoming tyrannical and dictatorial. Not only is that a potential outcome, but the lack of meaningful participation in one's community and that sense of control being held over them oftentimes creates the fertile ground upon which violence, especially immoral violence, perpetuates. What are the consistencies? Everywhere we see the most gun control, we also see the most violence. Everywhere we see the most tyrannical oversight, at least in the West, that's where we see the most conflict, the most abrasiveness, not in like aesthetic, but that's where we see so much of the suffering brought upon people by themselves underneath that boot, so to speak. And so it's a double-sided coin. It has more than one, or sorry, it has two fangs. It is a compound problem. Not only do people desire to become capable and trained so that they can meaningfully participate in their community, that they can look out after one another, that it is a sense of honor in a sense, or duty to their own, let's just not even go so far as to say tribe, but their own community that people prepare. But also the corruption of this principle, this desire in people, the outsourcing of it to other people oftentimes produces the very same attitudes, ideas, and environments where you see continual low-level violence paired with great swings into what we should probably call democide, which is the resentment that grows by contained people who are stripped of or prohibited from having a meaningful participation in their community, leads to outbursts of violence that oftentimes, once reaching a scale, cascade into catastrophes that we write about in the history books. And so the problem with LARP, in short, is part one. So it's not all physical. Many of us are living in fantasies in our own head. And part two, our end goal is not merely capability and possession, but participation. So if this has been helpful for you, you can find us at redactedllc.com or redactedcultures.locals.com, and we will talk to you soon. So now, go forth and conquer.